Hey guys, I promised I'd make you another cooking video, so I decided today to show you how to make some cinnamon buns. It's a really easy recipe. Most of the time if you make cinnamon buns from scratch, you have to use yeast and it takes several hours because you have to proof the dough a couple times. But this is an easy, no yeast cinnamon bun recipe that I think that you'll enjoy. It'll be a slightly different texture than a yeasted cinnamon roll, but these ones are really good. So to start off, I've washed my hands and I've preheated my oven today to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So to start, in this bowl, I've already measured out 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and we're gonna add to that some salt, baking powder, and baking soda. So this is 1 teaspoon of salt, a half a teaspoon of baking powder, and also a half a teaspoon of baking soda. So we'll mix that in. I'll just whisk it together to get it mixed before I put it into the stand mixer. The stand mixer is going to help us out today because it will also help to knead the dough for us. So I've got a dough hook on my stand mixer instead of the usual paddle, and we'll get that in. The next thing that we add to these cinnamon buns is a bit of vegetable oil. So this is 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. And if you didn't have liquid vegetable oil, you can always melt some butter or shortening or some margarine just in that same amount. And then we're also going to add buttermilk to this recipe. So this is buttermilk. You can just find it in the dairy section of the grocery store. It's used a lot in baking because it's an acidic ingredient. So the acid in buttermilk is lactic acid, and that acid is going to react with some of our leavening agents like baking powder and baking soda to make our cinnamon buns rise today. So buttermilk, although it has the word butter in it, it's not more fattening than regular milk. It's still 1% milk fat. But you'll notice, like when I pour it, or if you had this before, it has kind of a thick, creamier texture. But again, the key to buttermilk is that it has an acid in it. So if you didn't have buttermilk, or you don't want to go out and buy buttermilk, you can easily substitute it. You can use the same amount of regular milk, but just add a tablespoon of vinegar to it. And that vinegar, which is acetic acid, is going to make your regular milk more acidic and do the same job in your baking. And then of course, if you're non-dairy, you could use a non-dairy milk like oat milk or almond milk and just add some kind of acid, whether it's lemon juice or vinegar. About a tablespoon should do it. So I'm gonna have our mixer start this. Just to get it mixed together and going. The other thing that I'm gonna mention too is there's a lot of science when it comes to baking. So this is an acid, the leavening agents, the baking soda is a base. And so if you think about, if you've taken some chemistry, you know, you have an acid-base neutralization reaction, but one of the products that happens from this reaction is that it produces carbon dioxide gas. And so those gas bubbles are going to be what helps your dough rise. And then the other thing that's important to help your dough rise is to develop the gluten. So when we mix our dough and when we knead our dough, it helps that gluten form its structure. And so gluten is just the protein in flour, in wheat flour, and it forms like a protein matrix, and that structure of the dough is going to help hold in the carbon dioxide gas bubbles and give your baked good a really nice structure and help it to rise as it bakes. So I'm going to turn this on and let it mix for a few minutes, and then I'll come back and show you what your dough should look like. Okay, so I've had a chance for the mixer to knead the dough for a few minutes, and you'll know that it's the right consistency because this dough, it feels soft and it feels kind of stretchy. And so I know that it's been kneaded the right amount of time. If your dough is really tough, it's really dry, and it's just pulling apart, it probably means that you need to knead it a bit more. And if you don't have a stand mixer, it doesn't matter. You can just use your muscles and knead it with your hands and just work the dough for a good 5 minutes because it does need that time, like I said before, to develop that gluten, get that structure going. So now I've put some flour down on the counter and I'm gonna start rolling this out, and I wanna roll it out into a nice big rectangle. That's sort of my goal, is a rectangle, maybe about twice as long as it is wide. And we were talking before how we've got buttermilk in this recipe, and buttermilk is the acid. And you might think, okay, well, you know, we don't add buttermilk to a lot of things, maybe buttermilk pancakes or other, I don't know, quick breads. But, you know, there's lots of acidic ingredients that we use when we're baking. And some examples could be even just fruit acids that we add. And then also even things like yogurt, which also would have lactic acid in it. So there's different things depending on what you're making and depending on what leavening agent you're using. Because if you're using yeast, like in a bread, yeast is not the same, but it does produce carbon dioxide gas. So yeast is essentially, you know, a microorganism, okay? And you add that yeast and it gets activated when you add like warmth and moisture and some kind of food, which could be the flour or sugar in whatever you're baking. And then that yeast will start to grow. And as yeast grows, it also gives off carbon dioxide, which is bubbles, which is air pockets, which helps dough to rise, okay? So it just depends what you're working with, but it's always important to have some kind of leavening agent and not to substitute them, because something like baking powder and baking soda, they also work a little bit differently too. So I'm still rolling this, but it's almost the size that I want and the thinness that I want. So hopefully you can see it, but it's about a nice big rectangle. I think on the recipe I said make it about 15 by 8 inches. So I think I'm about at that size. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take about, this is a 1/4 cup of butter. It's softened, it's slightly melty, but that's okay. And we're going to put that right over all of our dough. So we're going to spread that. And then I'll show you what I do after. Maybe I'll try and change my camera so you can see the dough a little bit better, but we're going to add our sugar and our cinnamon as well. Okay, hopefully you can see this dough a little bit better now, but you can see that I've rolled out my nice rectangle and I've just spread that butter all over it. And the next thing we have to do is add our sugar. So this is some brown sugar, it's a 1/2 cup, and then I'm gonna add a teaspoon of cinnamon with it. And then we'll mix that around and just mix it together. And then this mixture is gonna get spread all the way across the top of this butter. And you'll remember it's gonna look like a lot of sugar, but there's no sugar that went into the dough. So you gotta make sure that you do use it all, because the sugar's not in the dough, it goes on the dough. And then what we'll do is we will kind of try and spread it right edge to edge, and then roll it up into our log, and then cut that into our buns. So you can just use your hands if they're clean, it doesn't matter. And then spread your sugar all over the dough, and then sugar and cinnamon. Try and keep it in there. Make sure you're working on a clean counter too. Clean your counter and your surfaces before you start rolling out dough. Some people use a cutting board. I'm just using right on my countertop, and it seems to go fine. And then pick one edge, the long edge, and just start rolling it. So just start rolling it up with your fingers. Just kind of pinch it as you go and roll it long side to long side into a nice log. And then sometimes I kind of bring the edge up over and fold it down, just kind of seal it up till I have my nice edge and it's a nice log. And then sometimes if there's like little pieces on the end, I just cut those off before I start. And then you're going to be cutting the rolls now. And so I would cut them about every inch, inch and a half. And you do, in baking, we always want to keep things the same size so that they cook evenly. Oops, that one popped open. But they should be the same size so that they all take the same amount of time to bake. And then I've got just a square cake pan that I've lined with parchment paper, and I'll take each one of these rolls, and you can see that you get this nice swirl, and you want to make sure that you face them swirl side up in your pan. So how many did I make here? 4, or I made 8. And that's what I usually make with this recipe. If we cut them thinner, we can get 10. And usually I do 8. Don't make them twice as tall. They just won't cook quite the same. It's better to make them shorter and smaller. And you can see in the pan that they're close together, but they're not quite touching. It doesn't really matter because they will pull apart if they do get close together. And if you don't have a square cake pan, you can use a round cake pan. It doesn't really matter, but don't use a flat cookie sheet because it's possible that they could kind of fall over as they're baking. So just place them in the pan like this with parchment paper, because when that butter and sugar melts, it'll make it really sticky on the bottom. So it's just easier to clean up. And also I find that things don't burn as easily if I use parchment paper. And these are going to go into the oven, 400 degrees. And for, I would say, what does my recipe say? About 15 to 20 minutes. I think they're only going to take about 15, but I'll let you know. Come back. Okay, the cinnamon buns are all done and they're looking and smelling really good. So I'll show you what they should look like. They've just got a little bit golden brown on the top, and that's really what you can look for. And you can see too, our leavening agents have done their work and they've grown and they've puffed up and expanded a little bit. So I personally like these plain. I don't think that they need anything like a frosting on them because they're sweet enough for me. However, most of my family likes a cinnamon roll to have icing on it. So you can choose. I've left a little frosting recipe in the description of the video for you guys. So if you do, you can follow that frosting recipe and serve them plain or with a little bit of a plain buttercream or a cream cheese frosting on top, and enjoy them with maybe a nice cup of tea. But let me know if you guys try this recipe at home. I'd love to see pictures or hear about it. Anyway, you guys have a great day.